Picture a man hunched in a dark jail cell, his fingers blackened with ash, writing desperate prayers on cold stone walls. The words flowing from his hand aren't English, they're Arabic, elegant, flowing script that tells a story his captors can't read. This is 1810 in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and the man writing these words is Omar Ibn Said, a 40-year-old escaped slave. But 3 years earlier, he wasn't a slave at all. He was one of the most educated men in West Africa, a respected Islamic scholar who could recite vast passages of the Quran from memory, a teacher who shaped young minds, a trader who navigated complex commercial networks across Senegal. Now he's writing on prison walls, and those ash-covered words are about to change everything. Here's what I want you to think about as we go through Omar's story. How does someone maintain their identity, their intellect, their very soul, when everything has been stripped away? How do you stay yourself when the world is trying to erase you? Stay until the end, because the answer Omar discovered doesn't just explain how he survived. It reveals a strategy so brilliant that his writings are still teaching us lessons more than 150 years after his death. Let's go back to where this story really begins. Fouta Toro, Senegal, around 1770. Omar Ibn Said was born into privilege. Not the kind of privilege we might think of today, but something deeper. He was born into a wealthy Muslim family in a region known throughout West Africa for its Islamic scholarship. Think of Fouta Toro as one of the intellectual centers of its time, a place where knowledge was currency and education was power. Omar's family had resources, sure, but more importantly, they had access to learning. From a young age, Omar was immersed in Islamic education. We're not talking about casual religious instruction here. This was rigorous, demanding scholarship. He learned to read and write Arabic, which was his second language. His first language was Fula, the language of his people, but Arabic was the language of scholarship, of religion, of intellectual discourse across the Muslim world. Learning Arabic meant gaining access to centuries of Islamic thought, philosophy, science, and literature. He studied the Quran intensively, not just reading it, but memorizing vast sections of it. Imagine the discipline that takes, the hours spent in study, the mental training, the dedication to preserving every word, every verse, every teaching. Islamic education in Fouta Toro wasn't just about religious knowledge. It included mathematics, astronomy, history, and Arabic grammar. Students learned to analyze texts, to debate interpretations, to think critically about complex ideas. The educational system Omar grew up in had been refined over centuries. West African Islamic scholarship in the 18th century was part of a tradition stretching back to the great learning centers of Timbuktu and Jenne. Scholars traveled between cities, carrying manuscripts, engaging in debates, building networks of knowledge that connected West Africa to the broader Islamic world, stretching from Morocco to Mecca. Omar would have studied classical Islamic texts, works of jurisprudence, collections of hadith, commentaries on the Quran written by scholars from across the Muslim world. His teachers would have been part of this scholarly network. They weren't isolated village instructors, but educated men connected to a vast intellectual community. They would have had their own teachers, their own scholarly lineages, their own contributions to Islamic thought. When Omar studied under them, he was joining a tradition, becoming part of a chain of knowledge transmission that valued precision, memorization, and deep understanding. The daily routine of Islamic education was demanding. Students would wake before dawn for morning prayers, then begin their studies. They'd recite passages from the Quran, working to perfect their pronunciation and memorization. They'd study Arabic grammar, learning the intricate rules that govern the language. They'd analyze texts, discussing interpretations with their teachers and fellow students. This wasn't passive learning, it was active engagement with ideas, constant questioning, rigorous intellectual work. By the time Omar reached adulthood, he wasn't just literate. He was a scholar, a teacher himself, someone other people came to for knowledge and guidance. He worked as a Quranic teacher, which was a position of respect and authority in his community. Parents entrusted their children to him, knowing he would shape not just their religious understanding, but their entire intellectual foundation. Teaching wasn't just recitation, it was interpretation, discussion, helping students understand how ancient texts applied to their lives. Think about what it meant to be a teacher in that context. You weren't just passing on information, you were shaping how young people understood the world, how they thought about right and wrong, how they approached problems, how they saw themselves in relation to God and community. You were responsible for preserving knowledge and transmitting it to the next generation. That's a profound responsibility, one that required not just learning, but wisdom, patience, and genuine care for your students. He was also a trader, which meant he understood commerce, negotiation, the complex social networks that made West African trade function. This wasn't a simple life. Omar was navigating multiple worlds, multiple languages, multiple systems of knowledge. He dealt with merchants from different ethnic groups, different regions, different religious backgrounds. He understood how to build trust, how to negotiate deals, how to maintain relationships across cultural boundaries. Trading in 18th century West Africa required sophisticated skills. You needed to understand market dynamics, to know what goods were valuable in different regions, to assess quality, to negotiate prices. You needed to be able to travel safely, which meant understanding politics, knowing which routes were secure, building relationships with people who could provide protection or information. You needed to be multilingual, able to communicate with traders who spoke different languages. Omar's work as a trader meant he was constantly learning, constantly adapting, constantly engaging with new people and new situations. He was respected, he had status, he had a future that stretched out before him with possibility. His world was rich with intellectual activity. Futa Toro, in the late 18th century, was part of a broader West African Islamic scholarly tradition that stretched back centuries. Scholars traveled between cities, sharing manuscripts, debating theological points, building networks of knowledge. Omar was part of this world. He wasn't isolated in a small village. He was connected to a vast intellectual community. And then, in 1807, everything shattered. We don't know all the details of Omar's capture. Historical records tell us it happened during a military conflict, which was common in that era. The late 18th and early 19th centuries in West Africa were marked by warfare between different groups, political instability, and the devastating impact of the Atlantic slave trade. The slave trade itself created much of this instability. The demand for enslaved people from European and American traders meant that warfare became more frequent, more brutal, more focused on capturing people rather than controlling territory. Conflicts created chaos, and chaos created opportunities for slave traders. Victorious armies would sell prisoners of war. Raiders would attack villages, specifically to capture people for sale. Political enemies would be sold into bondage. The entire social fabric of West Africa was being torn apart by the economics of the slave trade. Millions of people were being ripped from their homes, their families, their lives. What we do know is this: at 37 years old, Omar Ibn Said went from being a free man, a scholar, a teacher, to being property. He was sold to slave traders. Can you imagine that moment? One day you're teaching students, discussing theology, engaging in trade. The next, you're in chains. Everything you've built, everything you've learned, everything you are suddenly means nothing to the people who now control your fate. The psychological shock of that transition is almost impossible to comprehend. You're a respected teacher, someone people come to for guidance and knowledge. You have students who look up to you, colleagues who value your opinions, a community that recognizes your contributions. You have a home, possessions, relationships, a place in the world. And then, in an instant, all of that is gone. You're being treated like an animal, like an object, like something to be bought and sold. The journey from capture point to the coast would have taken weeks, maybe months. Enslaved people were marched in coffles, chained together, forced to walk hundreds of miles to coastal trading posts. The conditions were brutal. People were given minimal food and water. They walked in chains, their necks connected by wooden yokes or iron collars. If someone couldn't keep up, if they were too weak or too sick, they were often killed, rather than slowing down the entire group. They were held in dungeons and barracoons, waiting for ships. These holding facilities were designed to warehouse human beings like cargo. People were packed into dark, airless spaces, sometimes underground, sometimes in fortified compounds near the coast. They might wait days, weeks, even months for a ship to arrive. During this time, they'd be inspected, evaluated, sorted by age and perceived strength. The slave traders were looking for people who would survive the voyage and fetch good prices in America. During this time, Omar would have been surrounded by people speaking different languages, coming from different regions, all sharing the same nightmare. The diversity of enslaved Africans is something we often forget. They weren't a monolithic group. They came from hundreds of different ethnic groups, spoke hundreds of different languages, practiced different religions, had different customs and traditions. The slave trade threw all these people together, stripping away their individual identities and treating them as interchangeable commodities. You're watching your old life disappear with every step, knowing you'll never see your home again. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what will happen to you. You're surrounded by suffering, by fear, by the constant awareness that you might not survive. And even if you do survive, you're heading toward a future you can't imagine, in a place you've never heard of, to be owned by people whose language you don't speak. Even the name sounds ominous, doesn't it? Omar was forced onto a ship bound for Charleston, South Carolina. We don't have his words describing that journey, but we know what those voyages were like from the accounts of other survivors and from the records kept by slave ship captains. Hundreds of people packed into spaces barely fit for cargo. The holds of slave ships were designed for maximum profit, not human survival. People were chained in spaces so tight they couldn't sit up. The air was thick with the smell of human waste, vomit, death. The physical conditions were horrific. People were chained in rows, lying on their sides or backs, with barely enough room to move. The ceiling of the hold was often so low that sitting up was impossible. In rough seas, people would be thrown against each other, against the walls, unable to brace themselves because of the chains. Seasickness was universal. People vomited on themselves, on each other, unable to move away from their own waste. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Dysentery, smallpox, measles, typhoid. The close quarters, the lack of sanitation, the weakened immune systems from malnutrition and stress all created perfect conditions for epidemics. People died every day, their bodies thrown overboard. The psychological torture matched the physical horror. You're surrounded by suffering, by death, by the constant awareness that you might not survive. And even if you do survive, you're heading toward a future you can't imagine. For someone like Omar, educated, literate, intellectually sophisticated, the shock must have been profound. He'd spent his life in the world of ideas, of scholarship, of respected teaching. He was used to being valued for his mind, for his knowledge, for his ability to teach and guide others. Now he was cargo. His education meant nothing to the ship's crew. His ability to recite the Quran, to teach, to think critically, none of it mattered. He was just another body to be transported and sold. The voyage from West Africa to Charleston typically took 6 to 8 weeks, depending on weather and currents. 6 to 8 weeks of hell. 6 to 8 weeks of watching people die, of wondering if you'd be next, of feeling your old identity being stripped away by the sheer brutality of the experience. It was designed to break people, to make them forget who they were, to prepare them for a life of total subjugation. Slave ship captains understood this. They knew that if they could break people's spirits during the voyage, those people would be easier to control once they arrived in America. It was meant to destroy hope, to erase identity, to reduce human beings to compliant property. When Omar arrived in Charleston in 1807, he entered a world designed to break him further. The American South's slavery system wasn't just about forced labor, it was about dehumanization, about stripping away everything that made a person who they were. Charleston was one of the major slave trading ports in North America. It was a city built on slavery, where the buying and selling of human beings was everyday business, where the entire economy depended on treating people as property. Enslaved people were held in pens, inspected like livestock, sold at auction to the highest bidder. Buyers would examine people's teeth, their muscles, their bodies, looking for signs of strength or weakness. They'd ask questions about skills, about experience, about temperament. The entire process was designed to reduce human beings to their economic value, to their potential for labor, to their usefulness to white owners. For someone like Omar, the shock must have been profound. He was sold to a slaveholder in South Carolina, and historical accounts tell us this first enslaver was brutal, harsh treatment, back-breaking work, constant degradation. We don't know exactly what kind of labor Omar was forced to do, but slavery in South Carolina meant rice plantations, cotton fields, brutal physical work from sunrise to sunset. Rice cultivation in the South Carolina low country was particularly brutal. Enslaved people worked in swampy fields, standing in water for hours, planting and harvesting rice in conditions that bred disease. Malaria was endemic, dysentery was common, the heat was oppressive, the work was exhausting. Overseers used whips to enforce discipline, to punish any perceived slowness or disobedience. The entire system was designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal care. The heat, the exhaustion, the constant threat of violence for any perceived disobedience. Omar went from being a respected teacher to being forced to perform physical labor he'd never done before, in a climate he wasn't used to, under conditions designed to break him. The contrast between his life in Futa Toro and his life in South Carolina couldn't have been more extreme. But here's where Omar's story takes its first turn toward resistance. In 1810, 3 years after his arrival, Omar escaped. Think about what that decision meant. He didn't know the landscape, he didn't speak English well, he had no resources, no network, no map, but he ran anyway. That's not just physical courage, that's intellectual defiance. Omar was asserting through action that he was still a person with agency, still someone who could make choices about his own life. Escaping from slavery in 1810, South Carolina was extraordinarily dangerous. If caught, he could be whipped, branded, sold further south to even harsher conditions, even killed. The entire society was organized to prevent escapes and to recapture those who tried. Slave patrols roamed the roads, checking papers, questioning any black person they encountered. White citizens were expected to stop and question any black person traveling alone. The legal system treated escaped slaves as criminals, as property that had stolen itself. But Omar ran anyway. He made it to Fayetteville, North Carolina before he was captured. We don't know the details of his escape, how he navigated, where he slept, what he ate. But he made it roughly 150 miles from South Carolina to North Carolina, which means he was resourceful, determined, and willing to risk everything for freedom. He probably traveled at night, hiding during the day. He probably avoided roads, moving through forests and fields. He probably went hungry, went without shelter, pushed himself beyond exhaustion. 16 days in jail. And this is where the ash-covered walls come in. Locked in that cell, Omar did something that would define the rest of his life, he wrote. Using ashes as ink, using the walls as paper, he covered the cell with Arabic script. Prayers, pleas, verses from the Quran, words that poured out of him in the language of his scholarship, his faith, his identity. Think about what that act meant. He's in jail, facing an uncertain future, probably terrified about what will happen to him. And his response is to write, to use the one skill, the one ability that truly defines who he is. Writing in Arabic was Omar's way of asserting his identity in a place designed to deny it. Nobody around him could read what he was writing. To the jailers, to the townspeople who heard about it, these were just strange symbols, mysterious markings. But those markings changed everything, because they proved something that the entire system of slavery was built to deny. They proved that enslaved Africans could be educated, sophisticated, intellectually accomplished. Omar's jail cell writings became local news. People were fascinated. Here was an escaped slave who could write in a language none of them understood. It challenged their assumptions. It made them curious. Word of the writing slave spread quickly through Fayetteville's elite circles. That curiosity led to Omar being purchased by James Owen, a member of one of North Carolina's most prominent families. Owen's brother John would later become governor of North Carolina. This was wealth, this was power, this was influence, and James Owen made a decision that was unusual for the time. He allowed Omar to continue reading and writing. He even encouraged it. Now, we need to be really careful here about how we understand this relationship. James Owen was still Omar's enslaver. Omar was still property, still legally owned, still denied his freedom. This wasn't kindness in any meaningful sense. Owen was part of a system that treated human beings as commodities. But within that terrible system, Owen's decision created a space, however constrained, however problematic, where Omar could maintain his intellectual life. And Omar used that space brilliantly. He was moved to Owen Hill, the family plantation in Bladen County, North Carolina. The plantation was a typical Southern estate with a main house for the Owen family and quarters for enslaved workers. The plantation economy was based on agriculture, probably cotton and corn, with enslaved people providing all the labor. There would have been dozens of other enslaved people living and working at Owen Hill, creating a community within the brutal confines of slavery. Omar's daily life would have involved labor, though we don't have detailed records of exactly what kind of work he did. Some accounts suggest he worked as a domestic servant rather than in the fields, which would have given him slightly more access to the main house and potentially to writing materials. Domestic work meant cooking, cleaning, serving meals, maintaining the household. It was still labor, still exhausting, still performed under the constant surveillance and control of the Owen family. But here's what makes Omar's situation unique. While other enslaved people on the plantation were forbidden from learning to read or write, Omar was allowed to continue his intellectual pursuits. This created a strange duality in his life. He was enslaved, subject to the same legal restrictions as every other enslaved person in North Carolina. But he had access to books, to paper, to ink. He could write. Think about what that meant psychologically. Every day, Omar was living in two worlds simultaneously. In one world, he was property, owned by James Owen, subject to the laws and customs of slavery. In the other world, the world he accessed through reading and writing, he was still Omar Ibn Said, scholar of Futa Toro, student of the Quran, intellectual, thinker. The act of writing became his way of maintaining that second identity, of refusing to let slavery define the totality of who he was. His days probably followed a routine. Wake early, perform his prayers in Arabic, do whatever labor was required of him, and then, when he had time, write. We know he had access to writing materials because we have the documents he produced. 15 manuscripts in Arabic have survived, plus additional documents in English. That means he was writing regularly, consistently, over decades. What did he write about? His 1831 autobiography gives us the most detailed picture, but his other manuscripts reveal the breadth of his intellectual life. He wrote religious commentaries, analyzing passages from the Quran. He wrote prayers and devotional texts. He wrote letters, though we don't know to whom. He wrote what appear to be personal reflections, thoughts about his life, his faith, his situation. One of his surviving documents is an exegesis of Quranic chapter 67, Al-Mulk, which means the sovereignty. This chapter deals with God's power and authority, with the nature of creation, with the consequences of rejecting divine guidance. Think about the layers of meaning there. Omar was writing about divine authority and human tyranny while living under human tyranny. He was using Islamic theology to make sense of his enslavement, to maintain his faith in a just God despite experiencing profound injustice. The chapter opens with verses about God's dominion over all creation, about how God created death and life to test which of you is best indeed. For Omar, writing about these verses must have been a way of contextualizing his suffering, of placing it within a larger theological framework. If God is sovereign over all creation, then even slavery, as unjust and brutal as it is, exists within God's ultimate plan. That doesn't make slavery right, but it might have given Omar a way to maintain hope, to believe that justice would ultimately prevail even if he didn't live to see it. Another document contains his transcription of Quranic chapter 110, An-Nasr, which means the help or the victory. This is a short chapter about God's support and the importance of seeking forgiveness. Omar wrote this chapter out multiple times in different documents. It clearly held special meaning for him, perhaps as a source of comfort, perhaps as a reminder that ultimate justice comes from God, even when human justice fails. The chapter is only 3 verses long, but those verses carry profound meaning. When the victory of God has come and the conquest, and you see the people entering into the religion of God in multitudes, then exalt him with praise of your Lord and ask forgiveness of him. Indeed, he is ever accepting of repentance. For Omar, these verses might have represented hope for eventual liberation, for a time when oppression would end and justice would prevail. The fact that Omar was writing these religious texts in Arabic meant he was maintaining a completely private spiritual life. James Owen couldn't read Arabic. None of the Owen family could. The other enslaved people on the plantation probably couldn't either. This privacy was crucial. In slavery, enslaved people were constantly watched, constantly monitored, constantly forced to perform deference and submission. Every interaction with white people required careful navigation, careful presentation of self. But when Omar wrote in Arabic, he was free from that surveillance. He could express his true thoughts, his true feelings, his true faith, without worrying about how white people would interpret or judge those expressions. But Omar wasn't writing in isolation. He was part of a larger, mostly invisible community of enslaved Muslims in America. Historians estimate that about 10% of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were Muslim. That's hundreds of thousands of people who shared Omar's faith, though most of them couldn't maintain it the way Omar did because they weren't literate. Some of these enslaved Muslims became known to historians because they left records. Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, also known as Job ben Solomon, was captured in 1731 and eventually gained his freedom and returned to Africa. His story was published in London in 1734, making him one of the first enslaved Africans to have his biography published. Diallo was a merchant and Islamic scholar from Senegal who was captured while on a trading mission. His literacy in Arabic and his knowledge of Islamic law impressed the British merchants who encountered him, and they helped secure his freedom. Yarrow Mammoet was enslaved in Maryland and gained his freedom in 1796. He lived in Georgetown and became well known enough that Charles Willson Peale painted his portrait in 1819. The portrait shows an elderly black man wearing a knit cap, his face weathered but dignified. Mammoet was known in Georgetown as a devout Muslim who maintained his faith throughout his life. He owned property, lent money, and became a respected member of the free black community. Bilali Muhammad was enslaved on Sapelo Island in Georgia. He wrote a 13-page Arabic manuscript about Islamic law that still survives. The manuscript, known as the Bilali document, contains instructions for Islamic prayer, rules for fasting during Ramadan, and other religious guidance. Bilali was a plantation manager who oversaw other enslaved workers, and he used his position to maintain Islamic practices among the enslaved community on Sapelo Island. Lamin Kibé was interviewed by Theodore Dwight Jr. in 1835 and provided detailed information about his life in West Africa before enslavement. Kibé was a teacher and scholar from Guinea who was captured in his 20s and spent 30 years enslaved in Georgia and South Carolina. He maintained his literacy in Arabic throughout his enslavement and eventually gained his freedom. His interviews with Dwight provide valuable information about Islamic education in West Africa and the experience of enslaved Muslims in America. These men, like Omar, were educated Muslims who tried to maintain their faith and literacy under slavery. They represent a hidden history, a story that challenges our assumptions about who enslaved Africans were and what they knew. They weren't the illiterate, uncivilized people that slavery's defenders claimed they were. They were scholars, teachers, intellectuals who had been violently torn from sophisticated societies and forced into bondage. But Omar's case is unique because of the volume and variety of his writings that survived. We have more documentation of Omar's intellectual life than we do of any other enslaved Muslim in America. His manuscripts give us a window into how one man navigated the impossible situation of being an educated Muslim scholar trapped in a Christian slave society. The relationship between Omar and the Owen family evolved over the decades. In 1836, James Owen sold the Owen Hill plantation and the family moved to Wilmington, North Carolina. Omar moved with them. He was in his mid-60s by then, still enslaved, still owned by James Owen. Wilmington was a port city, more urban than Bladen County, with a different rhythm of life. Omar would have encountered more people, more diversity, more activity. James Owen died in 1859, and Omar became the property of Owen's son. By this point, Omar was in his late 80s. He'd been enslaved for over 50 years. The Owen family continued to allow him to read and write, continued to present him to visitors as a curiosity, a learned African who could write in Arabic. And visitors came. Omar became something of a celebrity in certain circles. Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, heard about Omar and sent him an Arabic language Bible in the 1820s. Key was deeply involved with the American Colonization Society, an organization that wanted to send freed Black Americans to Africa to establish colonies. The society's motives were mixed. Some members genuinely believed Black Americans would have better opportunities in Africa. Others simply wanted to remove free Black people from America because they saw them as a threat to slavery. Key was interested in Omar as a potential Christian missionary who could return to West Africa and spread Christianity. This interest led to one of the most fascinating and debated aspects of Omar's story, his apparent conversion to Christianity. In 1821, Omar was baptized into the Presbyterian Church. He became a member of the Fayetteville Presbyterian Church, attending services, participating in the Christian community. On the surface, this looks like a straightforward religious conversion. An enslaved Muslim scholar becomes Christian. But when you look deeper, the picture gets much more complicated. Omar wrote out the Lord's Prayer in Arabic, and it signed Uncle Moreau, the name white Americans used for him. But here's the thing, when asked to write the Lord's Prayer, Omar actually wrote something else. He transcribed from memory Quranic chapter 10 and Nasr. He substituted Islamic text for Christian text, and nobody around him knew. They couldn't read Arabic, so they assumed he was writing what they'd asked for. But he wasn't. He was writing his own prayer, his own faith, his own truth. This act of substitution is brilliant. Its resistance hidden in plain sight. Omar was giving white Christians what they wanted to see, a converted Muslim writing Christian prayers, while actually maintaining his Islamic faith in a language they couldn't access. It's intellectual resistance at its most sophisticated. Throughout his writings after his supposed conversion, Omar continued to invoke Allah. He continued to use Islamic phrases and formulas. His 1831 autobiography, written 10 years after his baptism, opens with Islamic prayers, "In the name of God the Merciful, the Compassionate." May God have mercy on the Prophet Muhammad. These aren't Christian formulations, these are Islamic declarations of faith. Omar's pastor, Reverend Matthew Greer, even speculated that Omar maintained parts of his Muslim faith alongside Christianity. In letters and documents, Greer acknowledged that Omar's Christianity seemed mixed with Islamic elements. This wasn't the clean conversion story that white Christians wanted. This was something more complex, more ambiguous, more interesting. So what was really going on? Here's what probably happened. Omar understood that his survival, his ability to maintain his intellectual life, his access to books and writing materials, all depended on the goodwill of the Owen family and the white Christian community around him. Converting to Christianity or appearing to convert, was strategic. It made him safer. It made him more acceptable. It allowed him to continue the work that mattered most to him, which was maintaining his literacy and his intellectual life. But Omar never fully abandoned Islam. He couldn't. His faith was too deeply rooted, too central to who he was. So he performed Christianity publicly while maintaining Islam privately. He went to church, he was baptized, he wrote out Christian prayers when asked. But in his own writings, in his own time, in the privacy of his Arabic manuscripts, he remained Muslim. This wasn't weakness. This was sophisticated resistance. Omar understood something profound about power and survival. He understood that sometimes you have to give your oppressors what they want to see while protecting what's truly yours in spaces they can't access. His Arabic writings were that protected space. His intellectual life was that protected space. His faith was that protected space. When Francis Scott Key and others offered Omar opportunities to return to Africa as a Christian missionary, Omar refused. Every time. If he'd truly converted and wanted to spread Christianity, wouldn't he have jumped at those chances? He stayed in North Carolina, enslaved, maintaining his double life, his double identity, his double faith. The Civil War arrived when Omar was in his 90s. By 1861, he'd been enslaved for 54 years. The Owen family, like many wealthy Southern families, supported the Confederacy. They moved from Wilmington to a farm on the Cape Fear River, trying to escape the disruptions of war. Omar moved with them. He was too old to work much by then, but he was still property, still owned, still bound to the family that had enslaved him for over half a century. The war that would end slavery was raging around him. Union forces were advancing through North Carolina. Enslaved people were escaping to Union lines, claiming their freedom. The entire social order that had defined Omar's life in America was collapsing. But Omar didn't live to see freedom. He died in 1864, still legally enslaved, still owned by the Owen family. He was over 90 years old. He'd spent 57 years in bondage, from age 37 to his death. He was buried in Bladen County, North Carolina. For a long time, that was the end of the story. An enslaved Muslim scholar who'd written his autobiography in Arabic, who'd maintained his intellectual life under impossible circumstances, who died in bondage. A remarkable life, but one that seemed destined to fade into historical obscurity like so many others. But Omar's story didn't end with his death, because he'd written things down, because he'd created a paper trail, because he'd left behind documents that couldn't be erased. His manuscripts survived, all 15 of them in Arabic, plus additional documents in English. They passed through various hands over the decades. The Owen family kept some, others were donated to institutions, some were sold to collectors. But they survived. And, in the 20th century, scholars began to take serious interest. In 1925, the American Historical Review published an article about Omar. In 1984, historian Alan Austin published African Muslims in Antebellum America, a source book, one of the first systematic attempts to document the lives of enslaved Muslims. Omar's story was central to that work. Austin gathered Omar's manuscripts, translated them, analyzed them, and presented them to a wider audience. Research intensified. Historians, linguists, religious scholars, they all wanted to understand Omar's writings. They wanted to understand how enslaved Muslims maintained their faith. They wanted to understand the role of literacy in resistance. They wanted to understand Omar. And then, in the digital age, something remarkable happened. The Library of Congress acquired Omar's manuscripts and created the Omar Ibn Said collection. 42 documents, digitized, preserved, made accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The centerpiece is that 1831 autobiography, The Life of Omar Ibn Said, now available in both the original Arabic and English translation. You can go online right now and see Omar's handwriting. You can see the elegant Arabic script flowing across the pages. You can see the prayers that open the manuscript. You can read his words describing his life in Futa Toro, his capture, his journey to America, his experiences in slavery. You can see in his own hand the proof that he existed, that he thought, that he felt, that he mattered. The collection represents something profound. It's evidence. Evidence that enslaved Africans weren't the inferior beings slavery claimed them to be. Evidence that Islam had deep roots in America long before most people realized. Evidence that literacy was a form of resistance. Evidence that the human spirit can maintain itself even under the most crushing oppression. If this story of intellectual resistance through literacy inspires you, hit that like button to help others discover how knowledge becomes the ultimate form of freedom. Contemporary scholars are still studying Omar's writings. They're analyzing his language, his theology, his strategies of resistance. They're examining how he used Arabic literacy to create private space within slavery's public control. They're looking at how he navigated between Islam and Christianity, between African and American identity, between enslavement and intellectual freedom. In 2011, a new edition of his autobiography was published, presenting English translations facing facsimile pages of Omar's original Arabic narrative. This allows readers to see both versions simultaneously, to appreciate the beauty of Omar's handwriting, to understand the physical act of writing that preserved his story. Scholars like Mary Jane Deeb at the Library of Congress have worked extensively with the 1831 manuscript, helping modern audiences understand its significance. Omar's story has become part of larger conversations about American history, conversations about the diversity of enslaved Africans who weren't a monolithic group but came from many different cultures, religions, and backgrounds. Conversations about Islam in America, which didn't begin with 20th century immigration but has roots going back to the earliest days of the slave trade. Conversations about literacy and education, about how knowledge can be both a tool of oppression and a weapon of resistance. His writings challenge us to think differently about slavery. We often imagine enslaved people as illiterate, cut off from their cultures, unable to maintain their traditions. Omar's life shows us that's not the whole story. Some enslaved people were highly educated, some maintained their languages, some wrote books, some preserved their faiths, some resisted not through physical rebellion, but through intellectual persistence. Remember that question I asked at the beginning? How does someone maintain their identity when everything has been stripped away? Here's the answer, Omar discovered, the answer that's written across those 15 Arabic manuscripts, across that autobiography, across those jail cell walls covered in ash. You maintain your identity by protecting the spaces your oppressors can't reach. For Omar, that space was language. Arabic was his fortress. Nobody around him could read it, which meant nobody could control what he wrote in it. He could pray in Arabic. He could write theology in Arabic. He could express longing for his homeland in Arabic. He could even substitute Quranic verses for Christian prayers in Arabic. The language itself became his freedom. But it wasn't just language, it was practice. Omar maintained his identity through daily discipline. He kept writing, kept reading, kept thinking, kept being a scholar even when the world told him he was just property. He refused to let slavery define the limits of his mind. Every document he produced was an act of resistance. Every prayer he wrote was an assertion of self. Every word in Arabic was a declaration that Omar Ibn Said, scholar of Futa Toro, still existed. And it was legacy. Omar understood something that many people miss. He understood that survival isn't just about making it through your own lifetime. It's about leaving evidence that you were here, that you mattered, that you were human. By writing things down, by creating documents that could survive him, Omar was ensuring that his story wouldn't die with him. He was creating a paper trail that would lead future generations back to him. That's why his manuscripts matter so much. They're not just historical curiosities, they're Omar's victory over slavery. Slavery tried to erase him, tried to reduce him to a body that could labor, tried to strip away everything that made him who he was. But Omar fought back with ink and paper. He wrote himself into permanence. He made himself impossible to erase. And here we are, more than 150 years after his death, talking about him, reading his words, studying his life, learning from his resistance. Slavery couldn't destroy Omar Ibn Said. It couldn't silence him. It couldn't make him disappear. Because Omar understood that the mind, once truly educated, once truly free, can never be fully enslaved. His story teaches us something crucial about transformation. We often think of transformation as changing from one thing into another. But Omar's transformation was different. It was about staying himself despite overwhelming pressure to become something else. It was about maintaining his core identity while everything around him tried to reshape him. That's a different kind of transformation, maybe a harder kind. It's the transformation of persistence, of endurance, of refusal. Omar was transformed by slavery in many ways. He lost his freedom, his homeland, his family, his community. He was forced into labor, into a foreign culture, into a language not his own. But in the most important way, he wasn't transformed at all. He remained Omar Ibn Said, scholar, Muslim, intellectual, writer. Slavery changed his circumstances, but couldn't change his essence. That's the lesson his life offers us. When the world tries to define you, when systems of power try to reduce you, when circumstances try to break you, you have a choice. You can protect the core of who you are. You can find the spaces, however small, where you maintain yourself. You can create evidence of your humanity that will outlast the forces trying to deny it. For Omar, that space was Arabic literacy. For you, it might be something else. It might be art, music, writing, learning, faith, community, love. Whatever it is, it's the thing that connects you to yourself, the thing that reminds you who you are when everything else is trying to make you forget. Omar's manuscripts are now digitized, preserved, accessible. They're studied in universities, they're cited in books, they're displayed in museums. They've become part of the American story, part of the African-American story, part of the Islamic-American story. They're teaching us about history, about resistance, about the power of the written word. But more than that, they're teaching us about human resilience. They're showing us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when freedom seems impossible, even when the entire world is arrayed against you, you can still be yourself. You can still think. You can still create. You can still matter. Omar Ibn Said died enslaved. That's the tragedy. He never saw legal freedom. He never returned to Futa Toro. He never got to live as a free man in America. But in another sense, Omar was always free. His mind was free. His faith was free. His identity was free. Slavery owned his body but never owned his soul. And now, through his writings, he's freeing others. Every person who reads his autobiography, who studies his manuscripts, who learns his story, is being freed from ignorance about what slavery really was and what enslaved people really were. Omar is still teaching, still bridging cultures, still asserting the humanity that slavery tried to deny. That's the ultimate transformation. From enslaved man to eternal teacher, from silenced voice to permanent witness, from property to personhood can never again be questioned. Omar Ibn Said transformed himself through the power of literacy from someone history might have forgotten into someone history can never forget. What limitations in your own life might actually be opportunities to assert your identity more powerfully? What spaces can you protect where you remain fully yourself? Share your thoughts below. And if Omar's story moved you, if his strategy of resistance through literacy inspired you, share this video. His manuscript survived for over 150 years. Let's make sure his story survives too, reaching people who need to hear it, teaching lessons that still matter, proving that transformation is possible even in the darkest circumstances. What's the one thing about yourself that no circumstance can take away? Share it below so we can learn from each other's sources of strength.